Joining me today is Hart Energy's editorial director, Wil Vermillion. We have with us Pam Lacey, Chief Regulatory Counsel at American Gas Association, Wil VanLoh, CEO and co-founder of Quantum Energy Partners, and John L., retired Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary at Southwestern Energy. We appreciate you all joining us. Lynn and I are really looking forward to discussing the importance of ESG in the oil and gas industry right now, and we know going forward. Thank you again for joining us. I'll get started with my first question really for all of you. How much scrutiny are oil and gas companies currently facing from investors to supply environmental impact statements, the sustainability practice reports? There's other ESG focused reporting as well.
Well, we found that, of course, it's in the news. You're very aware that there have been a lot of proxy resolutions brought up by activists looking for more ESG information, 2% scenario analysis, other things. And that really caught our attention, of course. EEI, the Edison Electric Institute, our sister trade association, and AGA, the American Gas Association, got together in order to produce some ESG metrics that we found that the investors actually cared about because we were getting pummeled. Our companies were getting pummeled with multiple sets of ESG metrics. Everybody seemed to have their favorite flavor, and some of them were very lengthy and not really relevant to our industry. They were more for international manufacturing concerns and had questions that were just not relevant to us. So I can tell you a little bit more about what we did in order to answer that, but yes, we were definitely noticing it, particularly with the number of proxy resolutions coming out. And maybe John has noticed those too, if you've had some experience with that.
Absolutely. Over the last decade, there has been a rise in interest from various shareholders, but it's not just people who have an activist or environmentalist position. It's also the mainstream now, yeah. Whether it's Larry Fink at BlackRock or it's other major investors, they are focusing on these things from a standpoint of sustainability of the business. Is this something that's going to be there over the long haul? And are companies revealing the information that's appropriate? What you said just a minute ago, Pam, about the different kinds of data the companies are asked to produce has been one of the things folks have been struggling with. Our industry is probably a bit, I'm out of the E&P sector most recently, but our sector has probably been hit up more than most in that vein, along with utilities, and therefore has had time to address some of these issues. But that still is a frustrating thing for investors because they look at different rankings and you can see comparisons of the company that gets a B+ rating in one company gets a D from another rater, and you don't know quite how to respond. But publishing data is key.
Yeah.
And Wil, I don't know what you're seeing from the investors that you have in your funds, what they are interested in.
Yeah, I was going to say, both of you all kind of come more from the public side of it, but on the private side, we call them LPs, limited partners, large institutions, they're pension funds, endowments, large pools of capital, both corporate as well as things like sovereign wealth funds. And, I think this thesis of sustainability, ESG, climate change, this is something that's not going to go away. And I do think our industry has been very slow to embrace it. Some companies are doing better than others, but I do think we're seeing the same interest in investors that invest in private equity funds are asking for the same kinds of information that public companies are getting asked for. And so, I think it's something as an industry, we do have to just recognize that these are the times that we live in. It's many aspects of ESG and sustainability are actually, they're good business. And so, I think we, as an industry, we've really just tried to resist it for resisting purposes. And I really do think, though, that you're starting to see this has become mainstream, both in the public and the private sectors. And it's something that if our industry is going to continue to attract capital, we're going to have to really up our game and get much better in sustainability and ESG reporting.
Yeah, and if I could key off of that, we actually on the utility side have not been resisting so much as getting on the bandwagon and saying, okay, let's talk to the investors BlackRock, Vanguard, the rating agencies, the proxy advisory firms, and even the NGOs and others. So what is it you're really looking for? What do you need to know about an electric or gas utility? And we put together a set of metrics we've got posted on our website. One of the things we heard from them was, hey, we really don't have time to go through your 80-page sustainability report. And the 75 different kinds of metrics you have, can't you just boil it down to something that's really relevant to your industry, to your particular kind of business? And what we did was go through an iterative process with them. Started out with a list. Okay, now we've got a list of 25. They said, no, too many. Boil it down some more. And we've gotten down now to basically one page for the electric utilities, one page for the gas distribution, another one for transmission, natural gas transmission. They wanted to have quantitative metrics if they could, and they wanted it to be comparable, because that was one of the complaints they had. There were so many, different sets of metrics people were marketing and saying was the greatest thing since sliced bread, but they weren't comparable. So they really have liked what we're doing, and I think it is a model that can be used. The other thing that we have right now is we ask them, so is there anything else you want? And they say, well, actually, we'd like to know about upstream. We'd like to know what the producers are doing. How sustainable is that natural gas supply that you're getting for generation, electric generation, and providing to distribution customers? We ask them, what metrics would you want to know about the producers? Because, we're utilities, we don't really know about that. We'll go ask them, but what do you want to know? Well, the main thing right now is methane emissions. What's your rate? Across the value chain, what's the life cycle emissions for natural gas? So not just the CO2 when it's combusted, but the methane emissions along the value chain. And so we have developed the Natural Gas Sustainability Initiative, NGSI. I will direct you to our website for more information, but it's www.aga.org. But we have a metric that is aligned with One Future, that is more comprehensive than the one that we had in our original ESG template. That was just for what's reported to EPA under the Subpart W mandatory greenhouse gas rule. NGSI also includes emissions that are below the reporting threshold and sources that are below the threshold, so that we can show a more comprehensive picture. Those emissions aren't the big ones. That's why they're not in the mandatory reporting, but we want to be comprehensive. And that is a way that limited partnerships and the majors can start to show the sustainability of their product. And I think that that would be it's not that difficult, and it is a place to start.
It really does lead to my next question as well. Wil, maybe you have an answer for this. What type of information, excuse me, is necessary, other than what we just talked about, to really satisfy investors these days beyond the financials?
Well, as Pam indicated, I do think that the biggest focal point today in the upstream space is methane emissions, both flaring as well as kind of fugitive emissions, whether it's leaks in the pipeline, other just, you've got central gathering facilities. I mean, there's just all sorts of areas, but the big one is obviously flaring. I think that's where the most focus is right now. And so, what I do think investors do want to know, at least in the private space, is, what are we doing in our portfolio companies to mitigate flaring? As those of those that know the upstream business well know that there are times, when you are exploring, you're out in remote parts where there's not infrastructure, flaring is necessary to test wells. And that's a small part of the industry. And everybody loves to point to that and say, well, let's, we have to be able to do this. But there's a lot of flaring that happens that could be negated. Yes, you have to lay some lines, some gathering lines to get it to get the the gas that's associated with the oil instead of flaring it. but that's a small cost, in our opinion, to the industry. If we don't deal with this issue, the costs are going to be much greater, right? And so that is one of the things. But I think in terms of the private world, our LPs want to not only see things like that, but they also want to see, what we are doing in terms of health programs, safety, governance, community engagement. So really, all of the HS&E aspects. We actually have a very comprehensive reporting package that we deliver to our LPs every year at our annual meeting, and that goes through all aspects of HS&E.
You alluded to that this oil and gas is kind of behind here. I was at a recent ESG conference in Houston before COVID, obviously. There's about 200 industry executives, energy executives there, and the question was posed, how many of you actually know what to put in a sustainability report? Do you think that we are actually prepared for the what investors are going to want? Because I think the scrutiny is going to just increase, right? Going forward.
It's a great question. The answer is no. I don't think as an industry we are prepared. I really liked what Pam said about how they went to the stakeholders and they said, "What is it that you want to see?" And that's exactly what we've been doing. We sat down with all of our large limited partners that have very sophisticated ESG programs and people in place to monitor what all their various private equity funds are doing. And that's exactly what we did. We said, what would you like to see from us? What are the things that are important? You are much further along in this and other industries than we are in energy. What do we need to be thinking about as an investor, as one of the largest private owners of private energy companies in the U.S.? And that was really helpful. I also think having discussions, we do own a number of public securities as well. So we've had a number of these similar discussions with the large, long-only, buy-side investors out there to really try to understand what it is that they want to see. And in working backwards from that, some of it makes a lot of sense, some of it doesn't make sense, and I think that's where the dialogue has to happen, to explain to them that what you're asking really is not either relevant or it's not measurable or it doesn't, it's not germane to the issue. But a lot of the things, the suggestions have been very good. And so I think, and the other thing I will just say is I think there's a general feeling in the energy industry that the environmentalists are bad, that they don't like us, that they want to put us out of business. And I'll tell you, it's actually been very refreshing to me in a number of the discussions that our firm has had with various environmental groups. They're really not that evil, person behind the curtain there. They have a lot of the same focal points that we have, is just being citizens of the earth and wanting to take care of the environment. And so what we have found is they're actually quite reasonable, most of them. I'm sure there's some that might not be, but a lot of them that we've engaged with, and we found that they're very open to understanding, what are the issues we're dealing with, and trying to come up with solutions that are reasonable, economical, and timely, right? That they understand that these things can't be changed overnight in some cases. So I think dialogue is the most important aspect of really getting the energy, in particular the upstream space, up to speed in terms of this is the new reality we all have to operate under. How can we do it in a way that makes sense for both sides?
Right.
And Will, I think that's spot on, that you've identified that it is a multitude of constituencies that we have to talk to: the investor community, our customer community. If my former company was principally a natural gas producer, the utilities and others that acquire that natural gas want to know that it was produced responsibly, because they have to satisfy their constituency, whether it's regulators or whether it's their investors. So all of those pieces come together. What, again, we've all struggled with is what information do people want to know, and how good are they at evaluating it? Unfortunately, there are services out there that sell evaluations that are not particularly sophisticated. It's mathematical models that don't really take in the nuances sometimes, or don't take in all of the relevant factors. Whereas when you deal with some of the very responsible environmental advocacy groups, or you deal with some of the sophisticated investors who have developed ESG teams, they can have a serious conversation about what's going on and pick up the different degrees of aptitude that companies have in addressing these issues.
Right.
I actually think that our industry is further along in many of these areas, or many people in our industry are further along than in a lot of other industries, where if the light bulb is just going on that, hey, I'm, I deliver groceries, or I drive ride services, or whatever it may be, that is in the value chain as well, in causing, whether it's methane emissions or other impacts on the environment. I think energy may be a little ahead of the game.
I think you're right. Actually, in conversations we've had with some of the national chamber, in the particular groups of trade associations across the country, they've been looking to EEI and AGA because we've led the pack in coming up with this consensus-based template of just a few metrics that the investor advisory group said that they liked, and with input from NGOs and some of the faith-based investing groups. We reached out to quite a broad swath of stakeholders. And I think really, both of you are really right on it, that you need to have this dialogue. There's some education that has to go both ways about what our operations are like. Which is, I mean, for example, water often comes up in some of these groups of metrics that are kind of standard for everybody, except that we don't have any water discharges for natural gas distribution. You do on the electric side for generation, cooling water, but it's not really an issue for us. So sometimes member companies have found that they've gotten a demerit, a bad grade on their answer for water because they said not applicable, because it's not applicable. So it really is important to have a real dialogue and to try to learn from one another.
Do you actually say, though, that some of the larger companies, Southwestern or I know Chevron's been really big with this. Is there a difference between a smaller scale producer, an independent versus, obviously a major, but I mean, even somebody who's a larger, independent producer, in terms of how far along they are in actually, attacking this with investors?
Well, I might take a first shot at that. I mean, I think clearly the majors have always been the most conscientious of HS&E issues, right? And so I think they're clearly ahead of the pack. A number of your large independents, I think, have jumped on this bandwagon in the last couple of years. But there's still a lot of public independents that do not publish sustainability or ESG reports. And many of them just this year have published their inaugural report. When you move to the private world, it's a whole different game. In general, I'd say that private operators do not, they are way, way, way behind the curve. Part of that is because, at least on the private equity funded private operators, their whole game plan historically has been, buy some assets, buy some acreage, drill some wells. It was more the buy and the flip model. And they weren't thinking about that they're going to be in business, long term. And so they didn't really feel like there was a need to address, these issues. I think, groups like Quantum and some of the other leading energy private equity firms, we do realize that it is a big part of our responsibility. And that's what we have to do, is really make sure that we kind of get our portfolio companies up to the same standards that public companies are fastly, moving towards. There's a lot of operators, though, in the country that are not private equity backed, that are private. And that is an area that I think, probably when I just think about our industry as a whole, I've got the greatest concern about, because they don't have public shareholders keeping them accountable. They don't have a large private equity fund keeping them accountable. And they really tend to be very cost conscientious, and they look at ESG as a cost center. As opposed to looking at it as this is an opportunity, they look at it as a cost. And I think that's a paradigm that I'm glad, you all are doing literally interviews like you're doing right now to hopefully get out that word. I know you all have a lot of private E&P companies that subscribe to Oil and Gas Investor, and hopefully things like this will start to change how they think about this issue.
A lot of them don't have the staff that the majors have, but I think that maybe if groups like AGA and EEI and the majors that are working with us on NGSI can provide sort of a model, maybe we can do some of the work for these smaller organizations, and they may be able to get on the bandwagon too, I hope.
Yeah. Well, and Pam, to that point, like one of the things that we've just, like literally we're in the market right now with an executive search to hire a head of ESG for Quantum. And one of that person's primary roles is going to be to interface with our portfolio companies for that very reason. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the scale, they don't have the time really to go do this the right way. And so, one of the things we feel like that's our, it's a big opportunity for us, but it's also our obligation, again, to be a good steward to ensure that our companies have access to that. And so we're just looking at it as we're going to provide that free as a service to all of our portfolio companies so they can just tack on to the ESG programs that we've developed, the reporting templates, and we see that as a way that, hopefully other energy private equity funds will follow suit.
That's great work.
My next question really, let's talk about examples that you've seen of how to handle ESG reporting properly. I think you've touched on that a little bit, but for best results, maybe there's any case studies or anything that you can cite, but what you've really seen there.
Well, I'm still going to pitch for trying to boil things down so that we're all doing one consistent thing so that it's comparable. And the other thing is that I hear this from my member companies all the time. The people who are involved in reporting are getting real reporting fatigue because they've got to do, they've got the SASB thing, they've got the task force on climate disclosure, 2% scenario, 2-degree scenario, and 6 other different things they're doing in addition to mandatory environmental reporting for regulatory compliance. So, for that reason, as well as being able to provide consistent, comparable information to investors that makes sense, I would really encourage everyone to try to find the metrics that really work for particular industries and then stick with those. Have an iterative process because we can always learn, and maybe there's something that we adjust along the way, but try to get everything wrapped up into one product or one way of doing it so that it's consistent.
Let me tell you some good news and bad news from my experience. The good news part from my former company was many years ago, we started disclosing information about what we used in frac fluids because people began to ask that question, and we said, let's do it. We then stepped up in water usage, in environmental reporting, other items that were already required, data we were already gathering, and began to publish them on our website. In 2016, we put together a corporate responsibility report, which ran through the GRI metrics, the global reporting initiative that several organizations use, and tried to tick all those off. Let me say, if you try to go to every major rater and every one of their items, you will die of fatigue. You will be having more people in your reporting function than anything else. But if you pick good ones, pick important ones that you see other people noting and pointing to, your methane levels, how you're improving, how that goes over several years. Those things work. When the push came to have 2 degrees Celsius reports, we took a look at that. We were approached by a shareholder about that, and we said, you know what, we will do that. We were in the process of pulling that information together. We hadn't done it just yet. We got that out, and that information is there. What is difficult, and Will alluded to that earlier, and you've mentioned that again, Pam, is smaller companies don't really have the staff to do all the things that larger companies decide they can spend the money on to do this. And that is a criticism that has come up repeatedly of the proxy advisory firms and these other rating groups is that they expect 900 metrics, or that's an exaggeration. 125 is not an exaggeration.
No, it isn't.
The number of metrics that you should report on, and just sometimes you're going to have to say that one is not as important, and we can explain why. Trade associations and major investors, be they public or private, are very helpful in coming up with a consensus on that, and that's where I think different groups, different constituencies need to spend some time is getting a coalition around something that doesn't seem necessarily to be industry supported, that it's community supported, and it also has the endorsement of the investment community.
Right. And we've included the 2-degree scenario in the qualitative part of our template, because some things you just can't do with a number. But
Right.
We've encouraged our members to describe their board process, how they've involved their board, how sustainability is built through the company from top to bottom, and definitely have that discussion about how they're going to adapt, but also how they're going to mitigate.
Yeah, the upstream part of the energy industry, certainly, just like the chemical industry, is sort of the poster child for movies of bad people with black hats and so on, doing things. And sadly, there have been people in our industry who behave that way. But there are many who are well ahead of it. And we're always going to have to deal with that kind of message, just like other areas where people can get tainted by public opinion very quickly due to some bad performance. But I think we can try to show that we are producing necessary products, essential products, and that we should have a social license to do that and not blow our right to that social license.
Right.
So I would ask then, is this an opportunity for the industry, to actually start showing doubters, I'll call them, that, it actually is a safe industry, and that is, natural gas, part of the clean energy future? Is this actually, as ESG reporting at some point becomes more standardized, I guess, I don't know if it will, but is this actually just an opportunity to get that message out? Another way to put documentation in front of people?
Sure.
Is that?
One of the reasons we developed the Natural Gas Sustainability Initiative metric for methane across the value chain, not just for the utilities, was to offer an opportunity for the upstream folks as well as our utility members to tell their story, show they're sustainable, show what they're doing, all the work that they're doing on methane emission reductions, and the innovative things that they're doing. And I'm sure that John and Will can tell their story about that too. I mean, I think that's really important for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it clearly creates the platform. It creates the sounding board, if you will, to have these discussions for industry to highlight. But it also is, I'm a big believer in accountability at all levels in an organization, and whether it's financial accountability, whether that's your how you treat your employees accountability, and how you treat the environment. And I do think that the bar has been raised. This is clearly companies are going to be held more accountable, whether they like it or not. That will make this a better industry, but it also gives us these kind of discussions. The sustainability reports that we put out to our investors give us an opportunity to really highlight, the great good that this industry really does do. And I do think it's, the industry really does. It's a little bit of an easy target, if you will. People love to talk about bad big oil, but bad big oil does a lot of really, really good things for our country, for our national security, for jobs, for taxes, for communities, and it's getting a lot better at doing that in an environmentally responsible and socially responsible way. So I think that it's an awesome opportunity for us to highlight that.
Yeah, and you can show changes over time. You can show how you're reducing emissions, for example.
Yes.
If you measure it, then you can control it.
That's right. You can't manage something that you don't measure, so you have to measure it first.
Well, do you think there would there would need to be a unified standard, such as a Moody's rating kind of thing, for everybody to follow the same language here? Or I don't think everybody is right now, right? And maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, would that help put a definitive, not only message for the public, but for investors together?
And there are some, I think it's Sustainalytics is one group out there that's doing that. There's a couple of other groups that are actually, I think, trying to develop some standards, working with industry. I think industry groups like AGA, in the upstream space, API and IPAA. I mean, I do think there are efforts underway to really develop some standards. The problem is everybody doesn't agree on what should be measured or what's important, and so I do think there's going to be a little bit of sausage making that happens as an industry as we kind of work through that. But I am hopeful that over the next couple of years that there are some standards that are developed and broadly adopted by at least the larger industry participants, the ones that investors are really focusing on holding the most accountable.
I think you'll be seeing the large money managers, the mutual funds managers in particular, with public companies trying to push these different groups that do ratings into certain areas. It's interesting on some of them. We've been talking a lot about the E part of ESG, but the S part of ESG comes up in several areas. And as you run through what this group rates, what this group rates, and what this group rates, it's very interesting sometimes. If you have a policy on a topic, one group gives you a total positive. It's an on-off switch. But they don't ask whether you followed the policy, whether you're breaching it on a regular basis. You turn to the next one, and it asks, how many times have you been cited for violations in the same area? Well, if you're talking about, call it child labor, call it whatever may be that may come up more in emerging countries, how your security forces treat people, things of that nature. Some people have a great policy, but they're in the news all the time for having issues on that topic. Whereas somebody else that does, a company like mine, which is solely domestic U.S., did not have policies in certain areas because, my gosh, follow the law. This is the United States. It's not happening in front of us. We upped our ratings simply by adopting a policy that we won't beat children as our employees. That's crazy when you think about it. But that's what's gone on in some of this. As people struggle with how you rate companies, what are really the salient factors?
Yeah, that's one that drove us nuts too. We're local gas utilities. We don't have child labor.
Yeah. There's a lot of things, that you now have to publicly acknowledge that you're against, that of course you've been against.
I think, Will, you mentioned it, that it's hard for people to agree. Is there a big difference between the oil producers and natural gas? And maybe I'll throw this, even to Pam on the nat gas side. I mean, on what you need to be talking about? Is there a disagreement in that regard, or
I don't think so much so. Or go ahead, Pam. Go ahead.
Well, not in the industry. We know what the metrics that really count are, and since we've been talking to the major investor reps for a couple of years now, we're pretty much in alignment on what makes sense for the utility side, and we've got this thing for the metric for methane. Eventually, we're going to branch out and we'll look at some of the other things that they say are important for producers, say for water management. Community relations, I think, is one that will come up. On the S and the G side, a standard one we have on our template is just diversity on the board, and I think they'll also have it in the C-suite, things like that. But there are just a few core ones that really matter the most, and I don't think there's all that much dispute about that in the group that we've been talking to.
Right.
Now, there are some groups where you have to explain why child labor is really not an issue for domestic companies, and water is not an issue for natural gas distribution. But I think we're beginning to coalesce around a core group of metrics that actually make sense for the industry.
Yeah, and Lynn, to your question, as it pertains to oil versus gas companies, I don't see a big disagreement there. I mean, most companies produce both. while they may be focused on more on one than the other. You know, flaring may be a bigger issue for oil companies because the associated natural gas that comes with oil in certain parts, but companies that are, you know, 80, 90% natural gas production, you know, they're having to be very focused on methane leaks, for example, you know, from gathering lines or central gathering facilities or compression. So, so I think the issues, you know, water is a universal issue, recycling water, being a good steward of how you recycle or discharge or using fresh water. Air emissions, you know, both oil and gas companies, you know, use compressors. They drill, most of them drill wells. They're burning hydrocarbons on you know, the drill pad. So the issues are generally the same. We don't see any real difference between oil and natural gas companies.
I think, Jessica, you had some questions about service companies. I know we don't have any here, but I'll let you.
We actually own 3 or 4 service companies, so I'm happy to take a question on service. So.
Yeah.
Well, that does help really, because we don't want to only talk about ESG, of course, through the lens of the producer or in other senses, but service companies we know have to do their part to make sure they're proving their ESG worth, so to speak, or just really reporting that. What should be the focus for service companies? Investors, we know obviously they have to pay attention to that, but also what do they need to offer the producers to get the contract so we're all continuing to work together as well?
Yeah. The service companies have to be, I mean, it's a partnership. It really is a partnership between the upstream and the midstream. I mean, upstream and the service company, or the midstream company and the service company. And so, you know, clearly there are different set of issues. Service companies aren't, generally speaking, having to worry about, for example, you know, methane emissions. But for those service companies, for example, that are, say, in the fracking business, you know, the question is do they continue to use, you know, frack crews or frack fleets that are powered by diesel, or do they switch to electric powered frack fleets and, you know, buy their electricity from green sources of energy? So there are things that I do think that even service companies in certain subsectors of the service industry can do to differentiate themselves. There's a lot of focus, I would say, in the service businesses that we own around safety. So of the ESG, the S part is a big part of the service sector in terms of reportable incidences, in terms of, you know, having very strict protocol that whenever, you know, this particular service company arrives on site, that they have signed off on the policies of the upstream company, that they're adhering to them as it relates to safety. Because it is the service industry tends to be very people intensive. And so there's a lot of issues surrounding making sure you're good, you know, taking care of your people, providing safe work environments, and the sort.
Along those lines, really, what about technology? You know, of course, we've learned so much about technology, even in this sense right now, how we're discussing together, you know, all from our homes or wherever we may be. What role do you think technology plays in helping to make a better story from the patch for companies to share, and then actually maybe help generate high caliber reporting? We know, as Pam was mentioning, and I think all of you are touching on, you know, staffing at different companies. How is technology going to help any of that?
I'll take a first shot at that because that's something we're spending a ton of time on. I would tell you technology, and particularly when you think about the Internet of Things, and being able to put sensors on every wellhead, on every piece of pipe, on every valve, that is going to be a huge aspect of helping the industry monitor and measure how well we're doing. Okay, so technology, I think, and then you look at things like drones being able to fly pipeline routes, being able to fly gathering line routes, fly over remote facilities, and, you know, check methane emissions. Same thing, monitoring drill sites. All that is really a massive amalgamation of technology that will make it possible for our industry to do a good job of measuring and reporting, you know, on an ESG basis. So I think technology is going to play a huge role.
And there's also the analytics of the data that
Right.
that comes in. The better tools there are today, and ever improving tools there are, to go through large blocks of data that you have and figure out what are the techniques that have worked better as you frack a well, as you do engage in other activities. what's going to be reducing the emissions. The low-hanging fruit for my company several years ago was putting leak detection equipment on every single well. I mean, my gosh, we sell the gas. What do we want to do? Flare it into the atmosphere? So that's, that was something that paid for itself almost immediately. But then having the remote connectivity, figuring out where leaks and problems could be and fixing those right away, but then also analyzing what vendors are doing in their systems and having those networks connect enough that we can gather that data in real time. It improved economics so much, as well as assuring that we were meeting our safety and health goals.
Investment is really important in funding from the government, actually, in technology. We were involved a good bit in the Department of Energy's ARPA-E project. It was called Monitor, that developed a lot of the drone technology, the methane detection and measurement technology that could be miniaturized, get the cost down, and put it on different platforms. So they could put it on a tower at a well site, or they could put it on a drone and fly it around, or they could put it on somebody's helmet and it would be going around. But the really important thing was to be able to have real-time measurement or at least detection of the larger leaks, because what we found in a lot of the methane peer-reviewed science studies that have been done is that a very few number of leaks are the major source of the emissions. It's what they call a fat tail. So that what we really need to address is find those bigger emitters and find them sooner so they're not emitting for a longer time. So instead of having some guy driving around in a pickup truck and every 2 weeks he visits the site, instead you've got something that's flying on a little drone, or it's on a platform sitting there by the well site, and it can tell you, not every single leak, but it can tell you when something's really much larger, and have that kind of real-time thing going back to a control room so that somebody could say, okay, now send the pickup truck out. Because what you were doing otherwise, if you tried to go out more frequently, you would actually increase greenhouse gas emissions because the truck has emissions. So that's really important. And it's, I know that appropriations discussions are underway right now. And I was happy to see that they are continuing funding for ARPA-E. And it's a really important part of DOE that tries to get technologies that are available in the lab, but get them commercialized, get them into market, and get the cost down so that they're really usable.
Finally, before we go, if I can ask you what your take is on ESG and the future of the oil and gas industry. We've talked about that, I think, throughout this entire discussion. Of course, this is a good opportunity to be able to show the good people that are in this industry, that are employing those and really wanting to help their employees and then the environment as well. John, you mentioned, of course, bad players. We all know we have to take all that into effect, but what about the public, the investment community? Right now is such a time of adjustment because of COVID-19 and, the historic oil price crash we know. So what are we looking at as far as the path forward and how we can continue to move forward with this industry?
I'm going to pitch our natural gas sustainability initiative. We would very much like to have participation by more of not just the majors, but the large independents to use this to show what their methane intensity really is, their leak rate.
I think that if we can demonstrate, as I think a lot in our industry have done, that gas and oil production can be done in an environmentally responsible way, that we will, and remind people of how they use what this industry produces. Interesting, in a COVID situation where maybe transportation was down, therefore you didn't see as much going into gasoline, jet fuel, whatever else, but the plastics business has boomed as people have separate containers, using plastics to take care of them. There are all sorts of sustainable things, but going back to it, it is really seeing what we do, turning the sunshine on ourselves, because it's a great disinfectant.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I might just pick up on something Pam said, that, you know, roughly about 1% of produced methane is actually emitted. And while that's 1% too much, that does mean we're 99% doing the right thing. I think the one thing you talk about the future of ESG that hopefully that the investment community will keep in mind though is, you know, when you look at the U.S., while we still have a good long ways to go, we do things here, quite frankly, much more responsibly than most of the rest of the world does. And so one of the things that I always caution people that are kind of taking shots at our industry to think about is if they hurt the U.S. oil and gas industry too much, all they're going to do is they're going to force people, the world's going to consume the hydrocarbons it's going to consume, irrespective of whether they're produced in the U.S. or somewhere else. And so what will happen is the U.S. and the world will get those hydrocarbons from other places in the world that are much less environmentally sensitive than the U.S. is. In case in point, you know, I recently read a study that as much as 10% of the methane produced in the former Soviet Union is emitted in the atmosphere, right? Similar, you know, many OPEC countries have very lax, you know, requirements around containing methane emissions. So when you look at the major producing areas around the world, hopefully, you know, the people that are focused on this, I mean, we're going to do our part as an industry. It's absolutely front and center now amongst, you know, the leadership in the oil and gas and midstream and the utility industry. Hopefully there'll be some accountability brought to the rest of the world that produces 87% of the oil that's consumed, because that really, quite frankly, when it comes to climate change, is a much, much, much bigger issue that the world needs to be focused on in terms of limiting effects of climate change as a result of the oil and gas industry. So those are the only kind of maybe parting words I'd have to share.
Yeah, and I'll just defer to all the experts. I learned a lot here today. So I'm definitely just glad to be part of this conversation.
I exactly echo what Len said, and I know on behalf of Len and I at Hart Energy, we appreciate the work that all three of you are doing in the conversation, what you've done in the past, and really getting the work done as well. Thank you so much for your time today. We do appreciate it.
You're welcome. Yeah,
Thank you.
For more Hart Energy videos, follow our social media channels.